Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I have been reading Henry Adams and the Making of America by Garry Wills, largely because I happened to find it at my charity bookshop. Earlier this year, I read The History of the United States by Henry Adams and enjoyed it quite a bit. And it is a habit of mine when I read a big work to try to supplement or augment that reading with third-party material or ancillary material. So, for example, years ago, probably a decade now, when I read The Tale of Genji, I also read some criticism. It seems like Harold Bloom is the only editor of criticism anymore. Of course, he is lately passed, and his place will have to be subsumed by another name at some point, possibly. But for the last decade or so, you cannot find criticism with any other name on it than Harold Bloom. So for instance, this year I started the year reading Tolstoy's War and Peace. I brought that out so that you could see it. And when I finished it, I did the same thing. I wanted to read some criticism, and it was, again, this series that I fell to. There was nothing else that I could find easily available. Well, there is one other book. And in this case, or rather in the case of the Tolstoy, I enjoyed the book quite a bit and retain nothing of it. Now, this one I retain probably nothing of either, but that's because it has been a decade since I looked at it. Still in beautiful shape. But this book really has me questioning the habit of always seeking out some sort of secondary material. Part of the reason is that it just reads like a book report. We had to do book reports in high school, if you remember. Sometimes they would even make you present the report. And you would make little notes, basically talk about what happened in the book, and then tell everybody that. The use of that activity to anybody else is hard to say, but I remember there was not a lot of critical depth to the sort of class assignments we had of that nature. And this reads like a big version of a book report. So Wills, I get confused with the names. Wills has some sort of a thesis, but you don't have the sense that it's anything beyond something that he was assigned by his teacher to come up with a thesis statement, and so he just came up with something that was plausible, not something that he had an innate interest in. He just wanted to get the report done and satisfy the criteria set forth. So I don't want to go too much into his thesis. Part of it has to do with he feels that Henry Adams derives a whole lot of his sensibility from his grandmother, the wife of John Quincy Adams, who was something of an outsider. He wants you to know that Abigail Adams was a bit of a SH asterisk T, let us say. More than once, he talks about how when her husband, John Adams, was going to be inaugurated to the presidency, she insisted that he ride a carriage that had a scutcheon emblazoned on the side. And he wants you to understand through that just what a controlling, petty-minded person she was. Now that's, of course, Henry Adams's great-grandmother, but he wants you to understand that the whole family carried some of that nastiness, I guess, except for the wife, the outsider wife of John Quincy Adams. And then he gives you in the first section, the book is divided into 3 parts. So section 1, he sets forth his thesis, his ideas, and then gives you a very loose biography of Henry Adams, cherry picking such details as he thinks will lend support to his thesis. I'm not saying that that's a bad operational standard for him. I think any scholar would do something of that sort. It's just in the case of what he has chosen for his thesis, I'm not especially sympathetic. And you don't get a full biography. There is also a fair amount of Wills's own prejudice against readers of the history by Henry Adams. He contends that most readers have read The Education of Henry Adams first, and apparently it ends with a heavy negativity in tone, or the negativity in tone persists throughout that work, possibly his last work or one of his latest. And he wants you to understand that the history of the United States was a much more positive and optimistic work, and so people are reading backwards into the earlier history, thoughts that they have garnered from the later work, The Education. So that's an abbreviated way of talking about these distinct works. I have never read The Education. That's the more famous work. It was the history that interested me. And I think that Wills doesn't believe that it's possible to read the history without having read The Education. But then he goes further and says that people who have read the history or claim to have read the history, they impute to it an aura of pessimism, if you will. And if they don't derive it from the education of Henry Adams, then they come to it by having only read the first 6 chapters of the history, and they are lying about having read the rest. So I found the book to be, I think to use his words, pessimistic. Wills contends that the first 6 chapters are meant to be dismal and pessimistic, so that by the time you get to the end, there are a paired, well, it's not exactly paired. There are 6 at the front and 4 at the back. So a set of book-ending chapters, so to speak, and that the ones at the back or the end of the book are ebullient and joyful and positive about the future of the country. And I cannot say that that was my experience. I found the book in its entirety to be rather negative. Now, in Wills's book, I have read the first 2 parts, as I would say. It's kind of confusing to talk about because part 1 is the making of a historian, which gives you the biography, and then part 2 is the making of a nation. So hence the title, The Making of America. But it's divided into 2 parts. So the presidency of Jefferson and then the presidency of Madison. But the thing is, they're all about equal in length. So to me, the book comprises 3 parts. So when I say 2 parts, I mean I have finished the section dealing with the presidency of Jefferson. And I am partly very glad to have read it because since he is mainly retelling what happened in Adams's history, I have a little sense he is presuming a reader that has not read the history by Adams. So he is, as one would do in a book report, he is retelling the gist, the major thrust of the story, so to speak. And there are parts, the second term of Jefferson particularly culminates in Jefferson's famous or infamous embargo. And how some of that came about in the extended form by Henry Adams was fairly confusing to me. And Wills is very succinct in his paraphrasing or retelling. And so I appreciate his book for that, at least in such cases where I especially had some questions the first go round. There was another incident. The ambassador from England comes, a new ambassador, and somehow Jefferson has a dinner party, and somehow the ambassador is slighted, and his wife is slighted. There's nobody to escort his wife into the dining room. And it was a big deal amongst people of the time, amongst the movers and shakers in the political world in Washington of the time. And Wills gives you 9 or 10 pages just rehashing that. And so in that instance, I had no sort of question the first time I read it. I understood what was going on. It struck me as something of a stupid incident or series of incidents, although it was of great weight to the persons at the time, the persons directly involved. It was a matter of great import, but I didn't need to go over it again. Whereas with the embargo, coming to it a second time, it actually helped me some of it I wish I had read before having read Henry Adams's history. But the picture of Jefferson at the end of his term. And Wills very nicely draws in similar instances from other points in Jefferson's career, where when the grasp of power eludes him and things are not going his way, he just sort of retreats into himself. And so he refuses to do anything. He just wanted to get out of the presidency without having to admit any kind of a defeat. The embargo went very poorly. So Jefferson, when I read it, I came out of the book having some sympathy for Jefferson, because even though he seemed somewhat incompetent some of the time, you have to recognize that we can look at his actions, his decisions, with the benefit of hindsight, which he did not. But he did not have, I guess. But the administration was accused of being a lackey to Napoleon, and you cannot read the history of the administration and have any questions about why it got that reputation. So I have yet to read Wills talking about the administration of Madison, and Madison struck me as well, a bit of a cipher, I would say, because in the History by Adams, you get no sense of Madison as a person at all. You get no sense, hardly at all, of a person who acts. You have very much similar to Jefferson in certain ways, but more so. You get the sense of a person who only at best reacts to situations, something of a black hole, in fact. You get no sense of any kind of light escaping out of Madison, except for one brief moment when, stupidly, the city of Washington is sacked. There's a moment when Madison hops on his horse, and you could see that he was a manly president after all. But otherwise, for the most of it, he goes about this war of choice incompetently, a war for which Jefferson should have prepared, but Jefferson naively felt that war could be avoided just by not wanting war. And Madison is, as I say, more of a cipher than that. It was a war of choice, but the reasons given were not straightforward. There were lots of people who just wanted to grab Canada. It didn't happen. But throughout the course of the History by Adams, you get the sense of a war ineptly prosecuted. By both sides, to be sure. But Madison and the people surrounding him do not come off with any kind of aura of brilliance, or even any kind of an aura of well-intentionedness, if I may. And at the end of his term, then we segue into those chapters by Adams, the 4 chapters, wherein he talks about subsequent developments, which are that once the embargo was a fiasco economically, and that segued into the war. And so that, well, I think the war started in 1812, I guess. So that puts it at Madison's second term, I think, and then persisted pretty much through. So the embargo and the troubles arising therefrom led into that. And so the economy was troublous through the embargo and then through the war. And when that ended and everybody could get back to doing business, then the money started rolling in again and everybody was happy. And Adams definitely suggests that it was this unconscionable debacle of this drawn-out war between the U.S. and Britain that cohered all of the disparate states, the peoples of the United States, into one solid country. And he makes a good case for that. But I believe that Wills wants you to feel that it was a brilliant escapade on the part of Madison, and that it worked out real happily for everybody involved, and that the final chapters by Adams suggest that this happiness just continued. Whereas I had a distinct sense of pessimism from those last chapters, in that they focused solely on making money. That was what came out of the war, that people didn't care much about anything else. They didn't care about right or wrong or justice, that sort of thing. They just wanted to make some money. And so that does describe the country I know, the country I was born into. But I think the thesis by Wills that Henry Adams ends his history on a note of positive euphoria is way mistaken. This is the kind of instance where I would like to hear somebody like Steve Donahue talk about the book, because most certainly he has read this book probably more than once, and I am sure he has read the history of Henry Adams, and again, probably more than once. And he retains what he reads, unlike someone like me, so he would be able to cogently tell you what Garry Wills got wrong and what he got right. As I say, Wills is not particularly a favorite author of mine. He sometimes turns a very delicious or delightful phrase, and I give him credit. He is a good writer, but it became clear to me through this that behind his being a good writer, he seems to be a bit small-minded. So he's an interesting writer in that he has a broad variety of interests. I have so many of his books in the basement, and maybe I will pull some of them out, because Well, for many years you could find him at the half-price books clearance rack for $2, and if I saw one by him, I would pull it out, and so they're in a box downstairs where I can get them. Now I question whether I should keep it or not. It will depend on how the third part or the final part goes with this, because it's not an easy read. There are paragraphs where I am delighted because he is helping me to understand something which I just couldn't put together from Henry Adams himself. Having a more distant view and a more contemporary to me view is really helpful. Wills obviously has read a multi-part volume biography of Thomas Jefferson, at least, so he brings other materials to bear. Not at all the sort that an anomalous critic such as Steve Donahue would bring. He has read, obviously, a book or two. Garry Wills has. And so some of that information is interesting. He makes some parallels between the embargo, setting up the embargo, and then the difficulty of getting out of the embargo. He makes a parallel between that and the war in Vietnam, which was raging at the time the biography of Jefferson, which he read, was written. So it's interesting stuff. But overall, given that it is mostly a paraphrasing of the Henry Adams history, and then where there is a little bit of thesis, let's say, it's thesis that I have doubts about or I just don't care that much about. It makes me question the value of reading a book like this after a book like that. Now, thanks to reading this, I will probably remember the closure of Jefferson's term better. Anytime you cover ground a second time or a third time, and particularly from a different source, you're going to have more relationships to tie memory to. So last year, I think I read Homer's Iliad for the first time, and I followed it up with a book of criticism, The Poetry of the Past. And it was kind of a good book, but it was kind of hard reading as well. It was about all that I could find as far as literary criticism about Homer, which is kind of odd, but I don't know what it was. I probably was hampered by my price point. You would suppose that Harold Bloom must have something like this, but I would guess it was too expensive for me, and one cannot count on the Chicago Public Library to have anything. So that may have been the deciding factor. I can't really say. But it has been my habit to want to supplement my reading of particularly a great work with more material, particularly written about the work. So, well, this is not criticism exactly about it, but it was a very valuable read to me. It is a book called Edward Gibbon and the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. A couple of years ago, I read Edward Gibbon, and this was a symposium held by a conference in Rome, January 6th through 10th, 1976, and it compiles the various papers read by the various participants in that conference. And so they were more or less interesting, and I can't remember now which ones really struck me. I liked Bernard Lewis quite a bit, and that led me to reading his little memoir. I think I read that afterwards. Arnaldo Momigliano gave a paper, and I liked his quite a bit. And Stephen Runciman did as well, and his, I think, struck me as the best, and that led me into a whole sequence of Runciman books, which I have read during the past year. So this, of all of the sort of subsequent materials to a book that I have read, this has been the winner of the lot, to be sure. The one about now I'm looking around and can't find anything. The one about Genji, as I say, I enjoyed reading it, I think, but I don't recollect much. And I'm speaking about books that deal with the work largely as literature, or in the case of Gibbon, as history. So when I was on the Lady Murasaki period, as I say, a decade ago probably, it was my Heian phase. I was reading all the other things from that period as well. You know, I found the book by Ivan Morris very helpful to understanding the world which the tale of Genji was set, but it did not deal with the tale of Genji specifically as a literary work, and so for that I relied on the Harold Bloom. And similarly with the Gibbon, I picked up the memoirs of his life because I am sure he talks about it in here, his great history, and I would like to know. This one I have not read though, so this waits for me to get to. And at the time I was reading Gibbon, I was alternating books. Penguin has Gibbon in 3 volumes, and it also has the Arabian Nights in 3 volumes. So I was alternating volumes, and Robert Irwin wrote a lot of supplemental material for the Penguin editions. And I think I disliked the very first essay that he wrote as an introduction, but then all of the subsequent essays in the various volumes I found delightfully helpful. And so I picked up another book, or a book by him about the Arabian Nights, as my next source to go to. Now that was a book that it was a little bit of a difficult read because I read it not in one setting, but it's not a book that I read, you know, a few pages at a time and then set it aside for a year or whatever. So it was, as a concentrated read, it was a pretty tough read because it was a little bit sort of silly and repetitive, but nevertheless rewarding. But when I got out from that world, I did not want to jump back in immediately. I never figured that I would have to read it right away. So we shall see. Earlier in the year, I had been going to do a buddy read with another booktuber, and she backed out because of a personal situation. And the book was Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. The last couple of years, I have ended my year with a reading of something by Mark Twain. And so I am still going to move forward with Huckleberry Finn, a book I have not read this year, and again, try to slot it for that window of time after Christmas and before the New Year. And in that case, I have a book of criticism here, I guess you would say, Was Huck Black? And this book made quite a splash when it first came out. I remember hearing about it. I have it's either a Signet or a Bantam edition of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn together. And Shelley Fisher Fiskin writes the introduction to it. And I thought her writing was superb, talking about Mark Twain and his relationship to the institution of slavery and his relationship to Black people in his world. And so I thought that it would be an ideal backup to the novel when I do read it. So this may well be one of the first books that I read in the new year. So let me just read you a little bit from the flap so that I can reacquaint myself with it. Published in 1884, Huckleberry Finn has become one of the most widely taught novels in American curricula. But where did it come from and what made it so distinctive? Shelley Fisher Fishkin suggests that in Huckleberry Finn, more than in any other work, Mark Twain let African American voices, language, and rhetorical traditions play a major role in the creation of his art. In Was Huck Black, Fishkin combines close readings of published and unpublished writing by Twain with intensive biographical and historical research and insights gleaned from linguistics, literary theory, and folklore to shed new light on the role African American voices played in the genesis of Huckleberry Finn. Given that book's importance in American culture, her analysis illuminates as well how African American voices have shaped our sense of what is distinctively American about American literature. I am sure that there is a lot of meat on them bones. Fishkin shows that Mark Twain was surrounded throughout his life by richly talented African American speakers whose rhetorical gifts Twain admired candidly and profusely. A Black child named Jimmy, whom Twain called the most artless, sociable, and exhaustless talker I ever came across, helped Twain understand the potential of a vernacular narrator in the years before he began writing Huckleberry Finn, and served as a model for the voice with which Twain would transform American literature. A slave named Garry, whom Twain referred to as an impudent and satirical and delightful young Black man, taught Twain about signifying, satire in an African American vein, when Twain was a teenager. Later, Twain would recall that he thought him the greatest man in the United States at the time. Other African American voices left their mark on Twain's imagination as well, but their role in the creation of his art has never been recognized. Was Huck Black adds a new dimension to current debates over multiculturalism and the canon. American literary historians have told a largely segregated story. White writers come from white literary ancestors, black writers from black ones. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. While African American culture shaped Huckleberry Finn, that novel in turn helped shape African American writing in the 20th century. As Ralph Ellison commented in an interview with Fishkin, Twain, quote, made it possible for many of us to find our own voices, unquote. Was Huck Black dramatizes the crucial role of black voices in Twain's art and takes the first steps beyond traditional cultural boundaries to unveil an American literary heritage that is infinitely richer and more complex than we had thought. So this most definitely sounds right up my alley. And the thesis here sounds to me like it jibes more with perceived reality that I recognize than does that of Garry Wills. So we shall see. I am intending to read this book during the week between Christmas and New Year's. So, not this book, I'm sorry, Huckleberry Finn. So I am planning to read Huckleberry Finn in the week between Christmas and New Year's. If anybody would care to join me, I would love to hear about it. I don't know that I am up for or capable of doing any kind of a group thing because I don't know how that works very well. But let me know in the comments if you'd care to read along, and I will see. But as I say, after I read Huck Finn, finishing hopefully on the 31st, then possibly one of the first things that I will begin in 2025 will be this. So that is how things are shaping up for me. Just to extend this video beyond any reasonable length, let me just show you, well, this was the edition of the Iliad that I read. I pulled out my favorite Moses Finley book, The World of Odysseus. This is another book that does not talk about the Iliad or the Odyssey as literature at all. It is using the bones of those literature as a ground from which to pick information about the world which produced them. Now, I thought I would read a little bit from Andrew Ford. The book was a hard read. It was a year ago, I think, that I read it, or something like that. And again, as with the Murasaki, I don't remember much from it. But the very first paragraph or two are lovely, I think. And once again, just lets you see what I saw in, oh, well, look at this sentence. This is just from further on in the introduction. Since we know that poets lie, it is easy for us to diagnose the dialectic playing here to shore up this idea of epic. Well, I don't know what that idea was. Makes me want to look at it again. I'll read you the first paragraph, though. After reading the Homeric poems, and indeed after reading interpretations of them, I cannot help asking about Homer and wondering what he thought he was doing. For to the extent that the poems themselves or interpretations of them persuade me that they are aesthetic objects, that they are cunningly wrought artifacts with a coherent literary meaning governed by a command of rhetorical effects, that is, that they are like what academic criticism since the 19th century has taken poetry to be, I am troubled by what we know of the history and origin of these texts. Though much is cloudy, it is now generally acknowledged that our Iliad and Odyssey represent only the final outcome, a fixing by writing of a long-standing art of oral performance and composition. For centuries before this transcription took place, and we are not sure whether it was in the 8th century or the 6th, or whether a master poet wrote it himself or dictated it or stood in line to give his contribution before some tyrant's art committee, the sum and substance of these poems and of all their antecedents, variants, and sequels were only a series of changing oral performances by many singers in many parts of Greece. It is not difficult to conceive that the very idea of poetry may have been profoundly different in a milieu where stable texts were never the primary and definitive form of a song, and where each performer presented himself only as the spokesman of a tradition and not as an artistically gifted individual. I think that Mark Twain certainly stands in the line of a tradition of that sort, and obviously Shelley Fisher Fishkin is saying that there were multiple streams that converged to produce Mark Twain. I think anybody who is a writer or who is a poet will probably recognize it is the confluence of disparate events, literatures that combine to make one's own self as a writer. So that is probably good enough for this video. If I think of it, I will tag on some cats. Thank you for stopping by my channel.
doing? Doing something shitty.